In the heart of Toowoomba, a quiet neighborhood hid a horror no one could imagine. When a respected man vanished and his home went up in flames, detectives uncovered a chilling truth. A brutal murder, a dismembered body, and a killer living just next door. This is that haunting story. It was a humid summer evening in December 2019 when the small city of Toowoomba, perched quietly on the Darling Downs of Queensland, felt an unease it couldn't quite name. The air was thick with the stillness that precedes a storm, the kind that presses down on the rooftops and makes the night feel heavier than it should. In a modest suburban street lined with gum trees and single-story brick homes, one man's descent into darkness was about to transform a peaceful community into a scene of horror. Peter Weaver had lived on that street for years. To most, he was the sort of neighbor who went unnoticed, the one who kept his garden trimmed, who waved briefly as he collected his mail, and who preferred solitude over social gatherings. His small, neat house reflected the kind of life he led. Predictable, quiet, and contained. Retired from his trade as a mechanic, Peter lived a life of routine. Each morning, he took a walk down to the corner shop for his newspaper and milk. Each afternoon, he could be seen pottering around his shed, fixing tools, or tending to his small patch of vegetables. He wasn't close to anyone, but he wasn't disliked either. People in Toowoomba knew him as a decent old bloke who kept to himself. Across the street lived Philip Alistair Harris, a man of contrast. In his early 40s, Harris carried an aura of volatility. His days rarely seemed to follow a pattern. Sometimes he could be seen sitting on his porch chain-smoking, staring blankly into the distance. Other days, neighbors heard shouting, sometimes to himself, sometimes to unseen people. He'd had run-ins with the police before, minor things mostly. Public disturbances, arguments that got too loud, property disputes. Rumors floated about his drinking problem and a history of substance abuse. But like many in the suburbs, most residents tried to mind their own business, preferring to stay out of the orbit of someone unpredictable. Peter and Philip's paths had crossed many times over the years, usually in passing. They weren't friends, not even acquaintances in the real sense. They were neighbors, familiar faces without connection. Yet beneath that surface civility, something was brewing. Harris had been growing increasingly paranoid. Some said he'd been muttering about people watching him. Others said he'd been complaining that neighbors were talking behind his back. Whether it was a gradual unraveling of the mind or a burst of violent resentment, no one could have predicted what he was capable of. On December 19, 2019, Harris spent most of the day inside his house. Surveillance cameras from a nearby intersection later captured him walking toward a local hardware store earlier that afternoon. He bought a small quantity of fuel and a new hunting knife. The receipt showed no emotion, no motive, just a transaction. Back home, he drank heavily, pacing his living room, the curtains drawn tight. Neighbors later recalled hearing the faint sound of music. Loud, chaotic, then abruptly silent. That evening, the street was quiet except for the occasional chirp of crickets. Around 8:30 p.m., a light flickered in Peter Weaver's window. He had likely just finished dinner and settled into his armchair. Then, somewhere in that unremarkable hour, Harris crossed the threshold from brooding to action. Knife in hand, he left his home and walked across the lawn to Peter's front door. What happened next could only be pieced together later through forensic evidence. The blood patterns, the overturned furniture, the wounds. But what was clear was that when Harris entered Peter's home, the encounter turned immediately violent. There was no sign of forced entry, suggesting Peter may have opened the door voluntarily, perhaps recognizing his neighbor and assuming there was no danger. Within moments, Harris lunged. The first blow was deep and fast, striking Peter in the chest. Shocked and caught off guard, Peter tried to defend himself, but the assault was relentless. Harris stabbed him again and again, 23 times in total, each strike more frenzied than the last. Forensic experts later described the scene as a storm of rage. Blood spattered across the walls, pooling on the tiles. The living room bore the signs of a desperate struggle. But the most chilling aspect came after the violence had ended. Instead of fleeing or calling for help, Harris remained inside the house. Something in him snapped completely. In the hours that followed, He took the knife and began dismembering Peter's body. The act was deliberate, mechanical, almost detached. Investigators believed he used multiple knives from Peter's own kitchen, methodically severing limbs and attempting to move the remains. Why he did it, even Harris couldn't later explain. Perhaps he thought he could hide the evidence, or perhaps it was an expression of a mind unraveling under its own madness. What was certain was that by dawn, Peter Weaver, a quiet man who never harmed anyone, was gone. Not just killed, but desecrated. When morning came, smoke still drifted faintly from the Harris property. A neighbor, walking her dog, noticed Harris sitting on his porch, staring blankly at nothing. He looked disheveled, his hands trembling, his eyes hollow. She thought he was drunk again and passed by without a word. Inside Peter's house, the curtains remained drawn, the lights still on. No one suspected a thing. Over the next 2 days, Harris tried to erase his crime. He cleaned what he could, bagged what he couldn't, and plotted a final cover-up. On December 21st, just after midnight, he returned to the scene with a jerry can of petrol. Standing in the darkness of Peter Weaver's front yard, he poured fuel along the floorboards, the hallway, and near the couch. A flick of his lighter, and the fire roared to life. Within minutes, flames devoured the small house, painting the night sky orange. Neighbors woke to the crackle of wood and the smell of smoke. Fire crews arrived quickly, but the blaze had already done its work. When firefighters entered what was left of the home, they made a grim discovery. Among the charred remains of furniture and roof beams, they found human remains, not just burned, but dismembered. It was immediately clear this was no accident. Detectives from the Queensland Homicide Squad were called to the scene at first light. Within hours, the quiet street that had once felt safe was sealed off with police tape. Officers went door to door taking statements. Every neighbor pointed in the same direction, toward the house of Philip Harris. As investigators pieced together the timeline, they uncovered a trail of evidence that would lead them straight to him. CCTV footage, the purchase of knives, the fuel receipt, the smell of petrol still lingering in his shed. Harris's nervous behavior over the following days only heightened suspicion. When detectives finally knocked on his door, he didn't resist. He simply said, "I knew you'd come." The tragedy of Toowoomba had unfolded behind closed doors, unnoticed until it was far too late. The man everyone thought they knew, quiet Peter Weaver, had been destroyed by someone no one truly understood. The small Queensland suburb would never be the same again, and the investigation that followed would reveal just how far one man's mind could descend before it turned monstrous. The morning after the fire, Toowoomba woke to sirens and smoke rising above the rooftops. News spread quickly. A house had burned down on the edge of town, and human remains had been discovered inside. For a community unaccustomed to violent crime, the word murder hadn't yet settled in, but unease spread like a whisper through the streets. Within hours, the property was cordoned off with yellow police tape, and investigators from Brisbane had arrived. Detectives in white forensic suits moved silently through the debris, sifting through ashes, collecting melted metal, and photographing the scorched walls. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burnt timber and something worse, the unmistakable stench of death. By late afternoon, confirmation came that the remains belonged to 63-year-old Peter Weaver. The discovery sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Peter wasn't the kind of man anyone imagined would die violently, much less in such horrific circumstances. He had no debts, no family feuds, and no known enemies. To those who had lived nearby for years, his life had been unremarkable, quiet, solitary, but peaceful. Detectives were left asking the same question everyone else was. Who could possibly want him dead? As investigators examined the ruins of Peter's home, the fire's origin quickly became clear. The blaze had been deliberately set using an accelerant. A melted plastic container, identified as a fuel jerry can, was found near what used to be the living room. Forensic experts traced the burn patterns and determined that the fire started in multiple locations, suggesting a deliberate attempt to destroy evidence. But the fire hadn't consumed everything. In the wreckage, they found a set of hunting knives, one of which still bore traces of human blood that had not been completely burned away. Beneath the floorboards, partially protected from the flames, investigators uncovered more bone fragments, torn fabric, and pieces of electrical tape. Each clue pointed toward a crime far more grotesque than a simple act of arson. Meanwhile, neighbors were interviewed one by one. Some recalled seeing Peter just days before the fire, tending to his garden. Others mentioned hearing loud noises the night before the blaze. Muffled bangs, perhaps an argument, and then silence. One neighbor, a woman who lived a few houses down, told police she saw Philip Harris walking toward Peter's house late that evening, wearing a dark jacket and carrying what looked like a small bag. Another reported seeing him again the next night, standing by the smoking ruins in the early hours, staring as firefighters battled the flames. Detectives soon paid Harris a visit. When they knocked on his door, he opened it calmly. His expression was flat, unreadable. He appeared tired, his eyes red, his clothes still smelling faintly of smoke. The officers noticed his hands were covered in small cuts, some fresh, some healing, consistent with handling sharp objects. When asked about Peter Weaver, Harris claimed he hadn't seen him for several days. He said he'd noticed the fire but assumed it was an accident. But his answers came too quickly, too rehearsed, and the faint tremor in his voice betrayed the truth. Detectives secured a search warrant within hours. Inside Harris's house, the evidence began to tell its story. Forensic officers found traces of blood on the bathroom tiles and beneath the sink. A pair of boots near the back door carried the same tread marks as those found in Peter's burned home. A jacket hanging in the laundry room smelled strongly of fuel. In a rubbish bin outside, they discovered a torn-up receipt from a local hardware store, dated 2 days before the fire, for a fuel container and a knife. Every piece fit neatly into place. The arrest came quietly. Harris didn't struggle or shout. He simply lowered his head as police handcuffed him. When asked if he understood the charges, he muttered, "I knew this was coming." It was a chilling echo of resignation, as though he had already accepted his fate. At the Toowoomba police station, detectives began the long process of interrogation. Initially, Harris denied everything. He claimed the blood in his bathroom was his own from a cut, that the fuel smell was from yard work, that the receipt had nothing to do with the fire. But as the questioning intensified, his story began to unravel. When confronted with CCTV footage showing him near the hardware store, he faltered. When told that his DNA had been found in Peter's home, he went silent. Then, for the first time, he asked for a cigarette and began to talk. His confession came in fragments. He admitted going to Peter's house that night, but said it wasn't to harm him. He claimed they had an argument about what he couldn't clearly explain. Some reports later suggested that Harris believed Peter had been spreading rumors about him or watching him through his windows. Whether true or not, those delusions had become real in Harris's mind. He told detectives he lost control, that the knife was meant to scare Peter, not kill him. But the brutality of the crime told a different story. When detectives pressed him on why he dismembered the body, Harris stared blankly at the table. "I don't remember," he said. "I just wanted it gone." That chilling line would later echo throughout the courtroom. He described returning to the house days later, fearful of being caught, and deciding to burn it down to erase what he'd done. "I thought the fire would make it all disappear," he whispered. But it didn't. The forensic team's findings confirmed what Harris had described, though his motives remained murky. There was no evidence of theft, no financial gain, no long-standing feud. What remained was something far darker, a violent outburst born from a disturbed and deteriorating mind. A psychiatric evaluation later revealed Harris had been suffering from paranoid delusions and severe depression. His mental health had been declining for years, and without treatment it had collapsed entirely. As weeks turned into months, the investigation expanded into one of Queensland's most complex homicide cases. Every forensic detail, from the knife marks on Peter's bones to the chemical traces of the fuel used in the fire, was meticulously documented. Police worked tirelessly to ensure that when the case reached court, there would be no doubt about what had happened. In the meantime, Toowoomba struggled to make sense of it all. The locals spoke in hushed tones about the murder, unable to reconcile the brutal crime with the ordinary faces they had known. A small memorial appeared outside Peter's burned home. A few flowers, a candle, and a handwritten note that read, "You didn't deserve this." For weeks, people would slow their cars as they passed by, staring at the blackened remains of what had once been a quiet man's life. When the case finally moved toward trial, the mood in the community shifted from shock to morbid curiosity. Reporters began to arrive, cameras set up on the street, and every new detail made headlines. The words "neighborly dismemberment" appeared in newspapers across the state. Behind those headlines, however, was a haunting truth. The victim and the killer had lived side by side for years, separated only by a few meters of fence. Yet the gulf between sanity and madness had been vast. By the time the prosecution assembled its case, one thing was certain. This was no spontaneous act of anger. It was a calculated descent into savagery, and the trial ahead would reveal just how completely Philip Alistair Harris had crossed the line from troubled neighbor to murderer. The story of what happened next, inside the courtroom and in the minds of those who witnessed it, would prove just as disturbing as the crime itself. The courtroom in Toowoomba District Court was silent as the judge entered. The air carried a heavy stillness, the kind that falls when truth, grief, and horror converge in one room. It was early 2024, 4 years since Peter Weaver's brutal death, and the community had not forgotten. Every seat was filled. Journalists, neighbors, family friends, and curious onlookers who wanted to understand how such savagery had unfolded in their quiet corner of Queensland. At the center of it all sat the accused, Philip Alistair Harris, head bowed, expression blank, as if the weight of the past 4 years had hollowed him out completely. The prosecution began by laying out a timeline that painted a picture of methodical brutality. They described how Harris had entered Peter Weaver's home on that humid December night in 2019, armed with knives and resentment. They showed photographs from the crime scene, blurred for the public but enough to silence the room. Each image revealed the chaos and violence of that night. The overturned furniture, the splatter marks, and the remnants of Peter's final struggle. Prosecutors spoke calmly but with precision, calling the attack an act of sustained, deliberate savagery carried out by a man fully aware of his actions. They presented evidence meticulously gathered over months of investigation. DNA matches between Harris and traces found on the murder weapon, security footage of him purchasing fuel and knives, and the discovery of his fingerprints on the melted jerry can use to ignite the fire. Every detail pointed unmistakably to his guilt. Yet the most haunting evidence came from the forensic pathologist, who testified that Peter Weaver had been stabbed 23 times, many of the wounds inflicted while he was still alive. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as she explained the pattern of injuries, the precision of the strikes, the force behind them, and the clear signs of overkill that suggested rage beyond reason. The defense team did not contest that Harris had killed his neighbor. Instead, they turned their argument toward his state of mind. Their strategy was to paint a picture of a man consumed by paranoia and deteriorating mental health. They argued that Harris was not of sound mind at the time of the killing, that he suffered from long-term depression, psychosis, and substance dependency that blurred his grasp of reality. A forensic psychiatrist testified that Harris believed Peter was watching him through his windows, that he felt spied upon, mocked, and followed, delusions that had grown stronger in the months leading to the crime. The defense argued this psychotic break had driven him to an uncontrollable frenzy. But the prosecution countered with cold logic. They reminded the jury that Harris's actions after the killing were deliberate, calculated. He had dismembered the body, returned days later with fuel, and set the home ablaze, all to destroy evidence. That, the prosecutor said, is not the behavior of a man unaware of his actions. That is the behavior of a man trying to conceal a crime. Those words hung heavy in the air. Over the days that followed, witnesses took the stand. Neighbors recalled Harris's erratic behavior. His shouting, his late-night pacing, his eyes that never seemed right. A friend of Peter's, who had known him for years, broke down in tears as she described his kindness, his routine, his complete lack of enemies. "He didn't deserve this," she said softly. "He was just living." The judge allowed her a moment to regain her composure. When it was Harris's turn to testify, the room tensed. He spoke in a quiet, strained voice, his words halting and uncertain. "I don't remember much," he said, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I went there to talk. I thought he'd been saying things about me. I just wanted it to stop." He described flashes, the knife in his hand, the shouting, the blood. Then his voice cracked. "After that, I couldn't stop." When asked why he dismembered the body, he shook his head, unable to answer. The judge watched him closely, weighing every gesture, every pause. The trial lasted 3 weeks. As the final arguments concluded, the jury retired to deliberate. Outside, reporters waited in the midday sun, their microphones ready. Inside, the courthouse remained hushed. After several tense hours, the jury returned. The foreperson rose, unfolding the slip of paper that would determine Harris's fate. "We find the defendant, Philip Alistair Harris, guilty of murder." There was no outburst, no drama. Harris closed his eyes briefly, as though he had expected the words all along. The judge thanked the jury for their service before turning his gaze toward the accused. "This crime," he said, "was one of exceptional brutality. It involved not only the unlawful taking of a human life but also acts of degradation intended to conceal that wrongdoing. The community is left disturbed and grieving." He sentenced Harris to life imprisonment, with a non-parole period of 20 years. The sound of the gavel marked the end of the trial, and the closing of a dark chapter in Toowoomba's history. Outside the courthouse, Peter Weaver's friends spoke quietly to reporters. "Justice was done," one said, "but it doesn't bring him back." The neighborhood where the murder took place remained scarred. Peter's home, reduced to rubble, was eventually cleared, but the empty block of land stood untouched for years. Locals avoided walking past it at night. Some said they could still see the flicker of phantom flames when the wind blew just right. In the months following the verdict, discussions about mental health and isolation surfaced across Queensland. Commentators pointed out that Harris had fallen through the cracks. A man showing clear signs of psychological decline, ignored until it was too late. Yet, even that debate couldn't erase the horror of his actions. The Toowoomba case became a grim reminder that evil does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it lives quietly next door, waiting for a moment to surface. Police officers who worked the case later described it as one of the most disturbing of their careers. Detective Sergeant Alan McNeil, who led the investigation, said in an interview, "It wasn't just the brutality. It was how ordinary it all seemed before. You had 2 neighbors, 2 quiet homes, and one night, everything turned." He paused before adding, "You never really know what's going on behind closed doors." As for Harris, he was transferred to a high-security facility outside Brisbane. Prison reports described him as mostly silent, withdrawn, often staring into space for hours. When asked by a psychologist years later if he regretted what he'd done, he replied, "I regret losing my mind. It was perhaps the only moment of clarity left to him." The story of Peter Weaver's murder continues to haunt Toowoomba, not just because of its violence, but because it shattered the illusion of safety that so many suburban communities cling to. A place where neighbors once borrowed tools and exchanged greetings now carried the memory of horror. People locked their doors earlier, avoided small talk, and kept to themselves. The tragedy had changed them subtly but permanently. True crime documentaries and newspaper retrospectives would later dissect every detail, trying to make sense of a senseless act. But behind the analysis and the headlines remained a simple truth. Peter Weaver, a quiet, decent man, lost his life to the madness of someone he thought was just another neighbor. And Philip Harris, consumed by paranoia and rage, became the monster next door. A reminder that sometimes, evil doesn't come from strangers lurking in the dark, but from the familiar faces we pass every day. In the end, justice offered resolution but not peace. The story closed in the courtroom, but its echoes lingered, in the blackened soil where a house once stood, in the memories of those who heard the screams too late, and in the collective conscience of a town that would never again feel quite the same after December 2019. In a quiet English village, a petty dispute over household rubbish spiraled into a brutal killing that stunned the nation. Two neighbors, years of tension, and one shocking moment of violence. This is the story of how ordinary anger turned deadly in the Halifax neighbor stabbing case. It was a gray, wind-swept morning in the quiet village of Midgley, a small community tucked into the hills near Halifax, West Yorkshire. The kind of place where people nod politely to their neighbors, where gossip moves faster than the mail, and where disputes are supposed to end with a muttered complaint, not a killing. Yet behind the calm facades of its modest flats and narrow lanes, two men were locked in a feud that had been festering for years. Samuel Moore and Carl Williams had lived under the same roof, separated by a thin wall and a shared courtyard. But their lives were divided by resentment, pride, and an argument over something as mundane as rubbish. Samuel Moore, 55, was not the kind of man most people paid much attention to. He kept to himself, often seen walking his small dog at dusk, head bowed, avoiding small talk. Neighbors described him as quiet, polite even, but withdrawn, someone who preferred silence over conversation. Behind that silence, however, lay years of loneliness and a creeping paranoia that others were out to provoke him. Moore's life had once been stable. He had worked for the local council, maintained a simple routine, and lived peacefully in the block of flats that would later become the center of tragedy. But as his health declined and his social world shrank, his tolerance for conflict did too. His neighbor, Carl Williams, 52, could not have been more different. Williams was outspoken, fiery, and often frustrated by what he saw as disrespect or laziness in others. Those who knew him said he liked to be in control of his surroundings, sometimes too much. He kept his flat tidy, his bins lined and labeled, and had no patience for those who didn't follow the same order. In the small shared complex, he was known for complaining about noise, about cleanliness, and particularly about waste disposal. It was in those bins, of all places, that the seeds of violence were sown. The feud began years before the killing, over a few bags of garden waste left beside the communal bins. Williams had accused Moore of dumping rubbish improperly, claiming it attracted rats and spoiled the area. Moore denied it, insisting that Williams was trying to make trouble. What should have been a passing irritation turned into a series of petty confrontations. They argued in the hallways, exchanged insults over the fence, and left angry notes on each other's doors. At one point, both men filed complaints with their housing association, each portraying himself as the victim of the other's harassment. Neighbors began to feel the tension. Some tried to stay neutral, while others quietly took sides. One resident recalled hearing shouting almost every week, Williams's voice booming through the thin walls, Moore's quieter but no less angry replies muffled beneath it. Over time, even the sound of one another's footsteps seemed to trigger irritation. It was like living with a bad smell you couldn't get rid of, one neighbor later told investigators. The police had been called more than once, but with no violence and no direct threats that could be proven, there was little they could do. Both men were told to keep the peace, and each went back to simmering in private. As the months turned into years, the psychological toll grew heavier. Moore became more withdrawn, avoiding shared spaces and changing his routines to avoid bumping into Williams. He kept his curtains drawn most of the day and began recording noises from next door, convinced Williams was trying to intimidate him. Friends said he had started to sound fearful, almost paranoid, claiming that his neighbor was out to get him. Williams, meanwhile, grew increasingly irritated at what he saw as Moore's passive-aggressive behavior. Bins left half-empty, rubbish bags left just outside the door, as if to provoke him. What neither man realized was that their mutual resentment had stopped being about bins long ago. It had become a contest of pride, control, and ego. By the autumn of 2023, the tension had reached breaking point. Moore's mental health had deteriorated, and he was no longer sleeping well. He had stopped taking his medication regularly, and his family, who lived elsewhere, had little contact with him. Meanwhile, Williams had made several fresh complaints to the housing authority, demanding that something be done about Moore's antisocial behavior. The authority, as before, sent polite letters advising both men to cooperate. Nothing changed. The silence between their doors grew heavier, charged with unspoken hostility. On the morning of the tragedy, the air in Midgley carried a chill that hinted at winter's approach. Moore woke up irritated. His bins had been moved again. He believed Williams had done it deliberately. By mid-afternoon, Williams returned from work, and according to witnesses, an argument broke out almost immediately in the corridor. Voices echoed through the stairwell, sharp and furious. One neighbor later described hearing Williams shout, "I've had enough of your mess," followed by Moore's trembling voice insisting, "Just leave me alone." What happened next would take seconds but destroy 2 lives forever. According to evidence later presented in court, Williams followed Moore back to his flat after the confrontation. Whether he intended to threaten him or simply to continue the argument is unclear. But what is known is that Williams stepped into Moore's flat without permission, a small but crucial act that turned fear into fury. Inside, the tension snapped. Moore, cornered in his own home, reached for a kitchen knife from the counter. In what investigators described as a frenzy of panic and rage, he stabbed Williams 17 times. The attack was brutal, chaotic, and far beyond any self-defense. When police arrived minutes later, they found Williams lying in a pool of blood near the doorway, and Moore sitting nearby in shock, his hands trembling, the knife discarded on the floor. His first words to the officers were simple and broken. "He came in. I just wanted him to stop." Paramedics tried to revive Williams, but the wounds were too severe. He was pronounced dead at the scene. As officers led Moore away, neighbors gathered in disbelief. The man they had known as quiet and polite had committed an act of shocking violence. The argument that had once seemed petty about rubbish of all things had ended in a killing that would haunt the small community for years. Behind the flashing police lights and the forensic tape, the flats stood silent, as if the building itself was holding its breath. What had begun as a feud between neighbors had become a story of obsession, fear, and the tragic consequences of anger left unchecked. The police investigation would soon uncover years of complaints, reports, and warnings, a trail of missed chances to prevent what happened. But for now, on that October evening, only one fact mattered. Carl Williams was dead, and Samuel Moore's life, along with his neighbors, was over in all but name. The calm village of Midgley would never look quite as peaceful again. As detectives began piecing together what had happened inside Samuel Moore's flat, the small village of Midgley found itself at the center of national headlines. Reporters descended on the narrow street where the killing had taken place, their cameras pointed at the now cordoned-off building. Police tape fluttered in the cold autumn wind, and behind it stood a block of modest brick flats that had become the scene of a shocking act of violence. To most residents, it was difficult to believe that a man like Moore, quiet, withdrawn, almost invisible, had carried out such a brutal attack. But to those who had witnessed years of bitterness between him and Carl Williams, the tragedy, while horrifying, did not come as a complete surprise. In the early stages of the investigation, police combed through both men's histories, uncovering a long record of neighbor complaints, police welfare checks, and housing authority reports. The documentation painted a picture of 2 men locked in a toxic cycle of accusation and retaliation. There were noise complaints, letters about overflowing bins, and even reports of intimidation. Officers who had responded to calls over the years recalled how both men seemed equally frustrated and frightened of each other. Moore often insisted that Williams was targeting him deliberately, moving his bins, banging on the walls late at night, following him when he left the building. Williams, in turn, accused Moore of playing mind games, leaving rubbish near his door, muttering insults, and deliberately blocking shared pathways. Each saw the other as the aggressor. Forensic teams spent days examining Moore's flat. Blood spatter analysis revealed that the attack had been sudden and violent, with no sign of a prolonged struggle. The majority of the wounds were to the chest and upper body, suggesting a burst of rage rather than a planned assault. Yet the sheer number, 17 stab wounds, raised troubling questions. Was it truly a momentary loss of control, or had years of resentment exploded into something darker? In Moore's kitchen drawer, detectives found a row of neatly arranged knives. The one used in the attack was a common kitchen blade, its handle worn smooth from use. Nearby, police found Moore's handwritten notes, pages of observations about noise, complaints about constant provocation, and sketches of the shared courtyard where he had marked bins and pathways. To investigators, it looked like a mind consumed by obsession. When Moore was questioned at the station, he appeared confused, exhausted, and deeply shaken. His first statement was halting and inconsistent. He said Williams had charged in shouting, that he feared being attacked, that it all happened so fast. He told officers, "He was right there, screaming at me. I just wanted him to leave." Detectives pressed for details. Did Williams have a weapon? Did he physically attack him? Moore hesitated before answering. "He pushed me. I just reacted." Throughout the interview, his voice wavered between fear and regret. He asked several times whether Williams was still alive, and when told that he had died, he fell silent, his face pale, whispering, "Oh God, I didn't mean to." Meanwhile, police began gathering witness statements from residents. Several neighbors described the long-running feud, mentioning that they had heard shouting shortly before the stabbing. One resident, an elderly woman living 2 doors down, recalled hearing a man yell, "You've gone too far this time," followed by heavy thuds. Another neighbor said she heard Williams shouting, "I'm not scared of you anymore." These fragments of sound painted a picture of a confrontation that escalated quickly and fatally. Detectives also interviewed friends and relatives of both men to understand their personalities and relationship. Moore's sister described him as a gentle man, but one who struggled with his nerves. She said he had been on medication for anxiety and depression for years and had become increasingly isolated after losing his job. "He didn't trust people anymore," she said. "He thought everyone was against him." Williams's cousin, on the other hand, described Carl as a strong personality, someone who never backed down from an argument. He admitted that Carl could be stubborn but insisted he would never have been violent. "He liked things done properly," he said, "but he wasn't a monster." The autopsy confirmed the violence of the attack. Carl Williams had sustained multiple stab wounds to his chest, abdomen, and arms, some defensive, indicating that he tried to shield himself. The fatal wound had pierced his heart. The pathologist noted the force used in several of the blows, calling it consistent with a frenzied assault. Toxicology reports showed no drugs or alcohol in either man's system, ruling out intoxication as a factor. The findings strengthened the prosecution's argument that Moore had acted in anger rather than self-defense. But as the investigation unfolded, a more complex picture began to emerge. Psychiatric evaluations of Moore revealed that he had been suffering from chronic anxiety, paranoia, and obsessive tendencies. He believed that Carl Williams had been deliberately tormenting him, and though much of this appeared to be exaggerated or imagined, the psychological strain was real. Doctors who assessed Moore noted that he exhibited hypervigilant behavior and a heightened fear response. In simpler terms, he lived in a constant state of alertness, expecting confrontation at every turn. When Williams entered his flat that day, Moore's mind may have perceived it as an invasion, triggering a violent response he could not control. The Crown Prosecution Service reviewed the evidence carefully. Prosecutors considered a charge of murder, arguing that the number and severity of the wounds indicated intent to kill. However, Moore's mental health and the long history of conflict complicated the case. His defense lawyer argued that Moore had suffered years of harassment and emotional torment, and that he had acted impulsively in a moment of fear. The Crown ultimately decided to proceed with a murder charge but acknowledged that diminished responsibility could become a factor at trial. As the months passed, the community of Midgley struggled to come to terms with the killing. The building where it happened stood eerily quiet. The flat that once belonged to Carl Williams remained sealed, its windows dark. Some residents moved away, unable to bear the memory of the crime. Others spoke of guilt, wondering if they could have intervened before it was too late. "We all knew something was wrong between them," one neighbor said. "We just never thought it would end like this." When the case finally reached Leeds Crown Court in 2024, it drew widespread media attention. The courtroom was packed, Journalists, family members, and curious locals filled the seats. On the first day, Samuel Moore appeared pale and frail in the dock, wearing a simple gray suit. He avoided eye contact with the Williams family, his expression blank but his hands trembling slightly. The prosecution laid out the facts with precision. 17 stab wounds, no signs of forced entry, no evidence of immediate threat. They argued that Moore, consumed by anger and paranoia, had lashed out with murderous intent. The defense countered by painting a picture of a man pushed beyond endurance. They described years of torment, Moore's declining mental health, and the fear he lived in. A psychiatric expert testified that Moore's perception of reality had become distorted and that, in his mind, he believed he was defending himself from imminent harm. His response, the expert said, was not rational, but it was not premeditated either. It was the product of years of psychological decay and fear. As the trial progressed, the courtroom became a place where two versions of the same story clashed, one of rage and one of fear. Family members wept quietly as photographs of the crime scene were shown. Jurors listened to the audio of Moore's 999 call, his voice shaking as he said, "He came at me. I didn't want to do it." The evidence was gruesome, but the emotions were even heavier. This was not just a case about a knife. It was a case about two men trapped in a cycle of hatred that neither could escape. When the court adjourned at the end of each day, the streets outside buzzed with speculation. Some sympathized with Moore, believing he had simply reached a breaking point. Others saw no excuse for such violence. Inside the courtroom, the question loomed large. Was this murder, or a moment of madness born of fear and obsession? As the trial neared its end, the answer would rest in the hands of 12 ordinary citizens who had to decide how far human provocation could go before it turned into irreversible tragedy. The atmosphere inside Leeds Crown Court was tense as the final week of the trial began. By now, the jurors had listened to hours of testimony, examined photographs too gruesome for public release, and watched the slow unraveling of two ordinary lives that had collided in an extraordinary act of violence. Samuel Moore sat silently in the dock, his expression unreadable, occasionally glancing down at the table in front of him as the prosecution delivered their closing arguments. Across the courtroom sat Carl Williams's family, their faces a mix of grief and disbelief. They had waited months to hear justice, yet what they were hearing was not a story of pure evil, but of two men consumed by resentment and fear until one moment of rage changed everything. The prosecution reminded the jury of the brutality of the attack. 17 stab wounds, delivered with force and precision, they argued, could not be explained as mere panic. The Crown's barrister stood before the jury, voice firm but measured, emphasizing that Samuel Moore had not stopped even after Carl Williams had fallen. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "this was not an accident. It was anger unleashed. Anger born of bitterness, yes, but anger nonetheless. Samuel Moore chose to pick up that knife. He chose to use it again and again until Carl Williams lay dying on the floor." The court fell silent. Each word hung heavy in the air. Then came the defense, led by a barrister whose tone was calm but filled with urgency. He reminded the court that Moore had lived in fear, his world shrinking year by year until his mind was no longer rational. "This is not the story of a cold-blooded killer," he said, "but of a man broken by years of harassment and isolation, a man who reached a moment of unbearable panic when the person he feared most stepped into his home." He spoke of Moore's mental state, his anxiety, his sleepless nights, his irrational but deeply felt belief that Williams was tormenting him. He pointed to medical reports describing Moore's declining mental health and the statements from neighbors who confirmed the long-standing tension between the two men. "You cannot measure his actions," he said softly, "by the logic of a healthy mind. You must measure them by the fear of a man who lost control." The judge's summing up was careful and deliberate. He reminded the jury of the key facts, the evidence of premeditation or lack thereof, the testimonies of mental health experts, and the legal definitions that separated murder from manslaughter. The difference, he explained, lay in intention. Did Moore intend to kill or cause serious harm? Or did he lose control in a moment of extreme emotional disturbance? The 12 jurors listened, pens poised, faces serious. Their decision would determine whether Samuel Moore spent the rest of his life behind bars or faced a lesser sentence that acknowledged his broken state of mind. Outside the courtroom, the case had become a talking point across Britain. News outlets framed it as a cautionary tale about neighbor disputes spiraling out of control. Television panels debated whether authorities should intervene sooner in cases of harassment and mental health decline. Some commentators expressed sympathy for Moore, calling him a man failed by the system. Others insisted that no amount of stress justified killing another human being. The public opinion was as divided as the courtroom itself. When the jury finally retired to deliberate, the wait was agonizing. Hours passed. The families on both sides sat in silence, their emotions raw and exposed. Then, after nearly 10 hours, the court ushered everyone back in. The foreman stood, holding the verdict slip with trembling hands. Moore rose slowly, his face pale. The foreman's voice was steady but subdued. "We find the defendant, Samuel Moore, not guilty of murder, but guilty of manslaughter." A collective exhale filled the room, half relief, half sorrow. Moore slumped back into his seat, his shoulders shaking. Across the aisle, Williams's family broke into quiet tears. To them, it felt like a hollow victory. Their loved one was gone, and no verdict could fill the void he left behind. The judge nodded solemnly, acknowledging the verdict, and announced that sentencing would take place the following week. During the sentencing hearing, the court heard one final round of arguments. The prosecution urged for a significant prison term, emphasizing the severity of the attack. The defense, however, appealed for leniency, highlighting Moore's psychological fragility and the years of conflict that preceded the tragedy. A psychiatrist testified again, describing Moore's mental decline as a slow descent into fear and obsession. The judge listened carefully, his expression grave. When he finally spoke, the courtroom fell silent. "Samuel Moore," he began. "This case represents a tragedy of the most profound kind. You and Mr. Williams were neighbors, two men who should have found a way to coexist. Instead, both of you allowed bitterness and mistrust to poison your lives. On that October afternoon, you lost control in the worst possible way. You took a life." He paused, his tone softening slightly. "However, I accept that you acted under extreme emotional disturbance and that your actions, while violent, were not premeditated. The court therefore sentences you to 14 years imprisonment." Moore nodded faintly, tears welling in his eyes. As he was led away by officers, he glanced once toward the Williams family, but they did not look back. In that fleeting moment, it was clear that both sides had lost far more than the law could ever measure. The courtroom emptied slowly, leaving behind only the echo of what had been said. A haunting reminder of how ordinary lives can collapse under the weight of unresolved conflict. In the months that followed, the story of the Halifax neighbor stabbing continued to circulate in the press. Documentaries dissected every detail, from the first argument over waste disposal to the final verdict. Psychologists spoke about the dangers of isolation and how untreated mental health issues could distort reality. Community advocates demanded reforms, calling for early intervention in neighborhood disputes before resentment could turn into tragedy. The case became a study in how violence often grows from silence, a warning that the smallest grievances, left unchecked, can ignite into something deadly. Back in Midgley, the block of flats where it all happened stood mostly unchanged, yet its atmosphere was different. New tenants moved in, unaware at first of the history behind those walls, but the older residents still felt the weight of what had occurred. The courtyard where Moore and Williams had once argued over bins was quiet now, the only sound the rustle of wind through overgrown grass. One neighbor, who had lived through the entire ordeal, said later in an interview, "It's strange, you know. For years they fought over rubbish, and in the end that's what everything became. Just waste. Wasted lives." For Samuel Moore, prison life was a strange mix of punishment and relief. Away from the constant tension of his flat, he was finally calm. In interviews with psychiatrists, he often spoke about regret, replaying the moment over and over in his mind. If he hadn't come in, he would say, or if I just walked away. But regret could not rewrite the past. He had taken a life, and the guilt would follow him long after his sentence ended. As for the Williams family, they struggled to make sense of their loss. Carl had been flawed, stubborn, sometimes abrasive, but he had been loved. His sister told reporters, "He didn't deserve to die for arguing over bins. Nobody does." Their grief became a quiet campaign for awareness, urging housing associations and police to take neighbor disputes seriously. "It's never just about the bins," she said. "It's about how people live, how they're ignored until something snaps." The story of Samuel Moore and Carl Williams remains one of the most haunting examples of how ordinary conflict can turn extraordinary and deadly. It was not a story of monsters and victims, but of two men caught in a spiral neither could escape. A story where pride and paranoia replaced reason, and silence replaced understanding. In the end, Midgley returned to its quiet rhythm, but beneath that calm, the memory lingered. A reminder that sometimes the loudest tragedies begin with the smallest of arguments, whispered through thin walls, until the silence breaks forever. In the peaceful heart of Edmonton's Westmount community, a nightmare unfolded behind ordinary walls. A kind woman vanished, and the neighbor she barely knew held a deadly secret. This is the chilling story of trust shattered, warning signs ignored, and a quiet home turned into a scene of horror. It was a late summer evening in 2023 when the calm of Edmonton's Westmount neighborhood was pierced by something no one could have anticipated. The fourplex on a quiet residential street had always seemed unremarkable. A modest building surrounded by trees, tucked between the hum of city life and the stillness of suburbia. But behind one of those ordinary doors, an undercurrent of tension had been growing, silent but persistent, between two neighbors who barely knew each other. One, a woman seeking peace and privacy. The other, a man battling his own inner chaos. Their worlds collided in an act of violence that left an entire community struggling to understand how something so horrific could unfold in such an unsuspecting place. Lauren Jarvis had built a quiet, independent life for herself. At 39, she had endured enough hardships to understand the value of solitude. Friends described her as gentle, thoughtful, and deeply compassionate. Someone who worked hard and kept her circle small but meaningful. Her apartment, on the upper floor of the fourplex, was her safe haven. She filled it with books, plants, and the comforting routines of everyday life. Neighbors often saw her walking to work in the mornings or returning with groceries in the evenings. She smiled politely, kept to herself, and gave off the kind of warmth that made others feel instantly at ease. But beneath the serenity of her routine, Lauren had grown uneasy. It started with little things. The sounds coming from the basement below, the strange arguments that seemed to echo up through the floors, the uneasy looks she sometimes received from the man who lived downstairs. That man was Ryan Farrell. He lived with his elderly father in the basement suite, a pair that had slowly gained a reputation in the building for being reclusive and difficult. While the father mostly kept quiet, Ryan often caused disturbances. Loud music, shouting at odd hours, and strange behavior that left other tenants wary. Lauren mentioned to a friend once that she found them off-putting. Still, she never imagined her discomfort would one day lead to her death. Ryan Farrell's life, by contrast, was one marked by instability and anger. At 37, he had drifted through periods of unemployment, erratic behavior, and increasing isolation. Neighbors rarely saw him in daylight. When they did, he appeared withdrawn, disheveled, and sometimes visibly intoxicated. He was known to get into arguments, not violent but unsettling enough to make people avoid him. Living in the shadow of his father, who was said to be frail and tired of his son's temper, Ryan seemed trapped in a pattern of resentment. Those close to the building often whispered that his mind wasn't right, that he spoke of people disrespecting him or plotting against him. Lauren and Ryan had little to do with one another. They might have exchanged polite greetings once or twice in the hallway, but that was all. There was no friendship, no history, No feud beyond the everyday friction of shared walls and thin ceilings. Yet, to Ryan, those small annoyances festered. The sound of footsteps, the creak of floorboards, the vibration of a washing machine. They became symbols of disrespect in his unstable mind. Over time, paranoia began to take root, feeding a growing anger that no one around him fully recognized. In the weeks before the crime, neighbors noticed Ryan becoming more erratic. He was seen pacing outside late at night, talking to himself. His father reportedly told someone that Ryan was not sleeping much, but no one intervened. In buildings like these, people learned to mind their own business until it was too late. That evening in mid-2023 began like any other. The sun dipped low, casting an amber hue over the tree-lined street. Lauren returned home after running errands, exchanged a quick hello with another tenant, and went upstairs to her apartment. She likely had no idea that Ryan Farrell was already in a volatile state, his thoughts spiraling between anger and delusion. What happened next would take only minutes, but those minutes would forever scar everyone connected to that building. Investigators would later piece together the sequence of events through evidence, timelines, and Ryan's own disjointed account. Sometime that night, Ryan confronted Lauren, either in the hallway or at her door. What began as a confrontation over noise or some imagined slight quickly turned violent. In a fit of rage, he struck her repeatedly with a cane, the blows landing with brutal force. Lauren, caught off guard and terrified, tried to defend herself, but the attack was relentless. At some point, Ryan used his hands to strangle her, the act so vicious and prolonged that it left little doubt about his intent. When it was over, silence returned to the fourplex, the kind of silence that conceals horror behind closed doors. Ryan, in his distorted panic, decided to hide what he had done. He wrapped Lauren's lifeless body in duct tape, covered her in a rug, and stashed her inside her apartment. He stayed in the same building afterward, just floors below her, as though nothing had happened. It was an act both horrifying and incomprehensible, the attempt of a man detached from reality to erase his crime through concealment. For the next few days, the building grew eerily quiet. Friends began to notice Lauren hadn't answered calls or messages. She hadn't shown up to work, which was unlike her. Her car sat unmoved, and her mail began to collect. A growing sense of unease spread among those who knew her, leading someone to contact the police for a welfare check. Edmonton officers arrived at the fourplex, unaware that the killer they sought was just below them. They knocked, received no answer, and eventually gained entry. The discovery inside was gruesome. Lauren's body, bound and hidden, revealed the extent of the violence she had suffered. Detectives immediately treated it as a homicide. The forensic evidence quickly pointed to Ryan Farrell. When police confronted him, his responses were erratic and contradictory. There was no clear motive, no rational explanation, only fragments of anger and delusion. He was arrested at the scene, charged with second-degree murder, and taken into custody while the community around him reeled in disbelief. News of the killing spread fast across Edmonton, carried by headlines that spoke of shock and sadness. To neighbors, it was unimaginable that a woman as gentle as Lauren could meet such a fate in her own home, and that her killer had been the man living right below her all along. For investigators, it was a case that raised more questions than answers. Why had no one seen the warning signs? How had a quiet residential block become the stage for such horror? As night fell over Westmount in the days that followed, candles began to appear outside the fourplex. Flowers, handwritten notes, and photographs of Lauren were placed near the steps where she had once passed daily. Her friends gathered in silence, sharing memories of her laughter and kindness. The building itself stood as a grim reminder of how thin the line can be between normalcy and nightmare. What unfolded next, the investigation, the trial, and the unraveling of Ryan Farrell's mind, would reveal how a chain of small, unnoticed moments led to an unthinkable act. The story of Lauren Jarvis was no longer just about a crime. It became a reflection of the quiet dangers that exist in the spaces between us, and how easily peace can fracture when darkness takes hold. When police took Ryan Farrell into custody, he was calm, unnervingly so. Detectives later recalled how his expression barely changed as they read him his rights, as though he couldn't quite grasp the weight of what he'd done. Inside the police van, he sat silent, staring out the small window as the flashing red and blue lights reflected off his face. To the officers, it was clear they weren't dealing with a man who had killed in a sudden burst of self-defense or panic. They were facing someone detached, lost in a world of his own fractured thoughts. Back at the crime scene, forensic teams worked through the night. Lauren's apartment had been turned into a silent testimony of the violence she endured. The cane used in the assault was found nearby, its handle splintered. Tape residue on her skin told the story of a desperate attempt to hide the evidence. But perhaps most haunting were the signs of everyday life left untouched. A cup of tea half-finished, a lamp still on, a book lying open on the couch. It was as though time had frozen at the very moment her world was taken from her. Detectives began piecing together a clearer picture of who Lauren Jarvis and Ryan Farrell really were. They interviewed neighbors, friends, and family, trying to understand what had led to this collision between two very different lives. What they learned painted a disturbing portrait of mental decline and isolation. Ryan Farrell's father told investigators that his son had become increasingly unstable in the months leading up to the killing. He had been hearing voices, talking about people upstairs plotting against him, and showing flashes of anger that frightened even him. He admitted he had considered getting help for Ryan but didn't know where to start. He was old, tired, and afraid that pushing too hard would only make things worse. Neighbors corroborated the father's story. They described Ryan as a man unraveling slowly, someone who used to exchange small talk, but had recently become withdrawn and volatile. A tenant from next door recalled hearing shouting late one night, angry words, followed by silence. Another neighbor mentioned how Ryan had complained about the woman upstairs making noise, even though Lauren was known for being quiet. She rarely played music, never hosted parties, and mostly kept to herself. But to a mind already slipping into paranoia, even the smallest sounds can feel like threats. As the autopsy results came in, they confirmed what investigators already suspected. Lauren had suffered multiple blunt force injuries before being strangled. The brutality of the attack shocked even seasoned homicide detectives. It wasn't just a killing. It was personal, uncontrolled, and fueled by deep, irrational rage. Yet the two had no personal relationship. That lack of connection made the crime harder to understand and, in many ways, even more chilling. Meanwhile, the news of the murder rippled through Edmonton. Local stations ran continuous coverage, showing footage of the fourplex surrounded by police tape. Reporters spoke to neighbors who described their disbelief and fear. For many, the idea that such a horrific act had taken place in a quiet residential block was almost unthinkable. Lauren's friends began speaking out publicly, remembering her as a gentle soul who never deserved to be caught in someone else's storm. A memorial fund was set up in her name, raising awareness about the dangers of ignoring early signs of violent instability. In police custody, Ryan Farrell underwent psychological evaluation. The doctors found him inconsistent and fragmented in his statements. One day he claimed he didn't remember what happened. Another day he blamed Lauren, saying she provoked him with disrespect. His thoughts drifted between incoherence and defiance. To the psychiatrists, it became evident that Farrell was deeply disturbed, possibly suffering from an untreated mental illness that had gone unnoticed for years. But his erratic behavior didn't erase the deliberate nature of his actions. The attack, the concealment, the attempt to live normally afterward. That combination of mental deterioration and cold calculation would become central to the legal proceedings that followed. As detectives built their case, they uncovered more about Ryan's troubled history. Records showed he had been arrested several years earlier for minor altercations, often related to substance abuse. He had never faced serious charges, but those incidents hinted at a pattern of aggression. He'd also been evicted from a previous residence after disputes with neighbors over noise and property damage. Each move seemed to isolate him further, and by the time he settled into the basement suite with his father, he had almost no social connections left. The community surrounding the building struggled to move on. For weeks, the scent of tragedy lingered in the air. Police cars parked outside, media crews filming, and crime scene tape fluttering in the wind. Residents confessed they could no longer sleep peacefully. Some moved out entirely, unwilling to stay in a place that now carried such heavy memories. For others, the incident forced them to question their own sense of safety. How well do we really know the people who live next door? Detectives interviewed Ryan's father multiple times, and though he wasn't implicated, the emotional toll on him was immense. He sat through hours of questioning, describing the night of the murder as a blur. He hadn't heard screams or fighting, perhaps because of hearing loss, perhaps because denial had shielded him. When police told him his son had confessed, he broke down completely. In a trembling voice, he said he'd feared something like this might happen but hadn't known how to stop it. "He wasn't always like this," he said quietly. Something broke in him. The prosecution began preparing its case, relying heavily on physical evidence, the autopsy, and Ryan's own conflicting statements. The timeline was clear. He had attacked Lauren in a fit of rage, killed her, and then attempted to hide her body. The defense, however, hinted early on that they would argue diminished responsibility, that Ryan's mental health had played a significant role in the crime. For investigators who had witnessed the aftermath, that argument was difficult to stomach. They saw not just madness but intent. In the months following his arrest, Ryan was held in a psychiatric facility for observation. There, he remained mostly isolated, showing little remorse. Occasionally, he would lash out verbally at staff or claim that people were plotting against him. Doctors noted that while he exhibited signs of paranoia, he also understood the difference between right and wrong, a crucial detail that would later influence the court's decision. Meanwhile, Lauren's family was left to grieve. They attended court hearings, listening quietly as her final moments were recounted in chilling detail. For them, the focus was not on the killer's mind, but on the loss of a woman whose life had been full of promise. They wanted justice, not excuses. Her brother described her as the glue of our family, someone who always tried to bring peace where there was conflict. Now, her absence had left a void that could never be filled. As the preliminary hearings began, the courtroom became a place of contrast. On one side, a family shattered by grief. On the other, a man detached from reality, staring blankly at the floor. The prosecution outlined a story of senseless violence, a murder driven by resentment and delusion. The defense countered with psychological reports, portraying Ryan as a man lost to his own mind. But as each day passed, the evidence grew harder to dispute. The cane, the duct tape, the concealment, they all spoke to intent. By the end of those early hearings, one truth had become undeniable. Lauren Jarvis's death was not just a random act of violence but the result of a slow, invisible decay. A man's descent into madness met with society's failure to intervene. And as the trial approached, the question no one could answer was whether justice could ever feel like enough for a life taken so brutally, in a place where she should have been safe. The courtroom was heavy with silence when the trial of Ryan Farrell began. Reporters filled the back rows, their pens poised, while members of Lauren Jarvis's family sat near the front, their faces drawn with grief and exhaustion. The case had already drawn significant media attention, not because of celebrity or spectacle, but because of the haunting ordinariness of it. A quiet woman murdered by her neighbor, a man she barely knew, in a building that could have been anyone's home. It was a tragedy that spoke to the fragile line between familiarity and fear. Ryan Farrell entered the courtroom in a gray prison uniform, his hair unkempt, his eyes hollow. At times, he seemed confused, at others eerily indifferent. The prosecution presented him as a man capable of control, someone whose anger had turned lethal, not a monster but not a victim either. They began with the timeline, methodically walking the jury through the evidence. The cane, the duct tape, the rug, and the physical signs of deliberate concealment. Every detail reinforced one central point. This was not an impulsive act of insanity, but a conscious decision to end a life and attempt to hide it. The defense, on the other hand, painted a different picture. Their narrative revolved around mental deterioration, arguing that Ryan Farrell was suffering from untreated psychosis at the time of the killing. His lawyer spoke softly but firmly, describing years of neglect, poverty, and isolation that had chipped away at his sanity. They pointed to medical reports from the psychiatric evaluation, which noted signs of delusional thinking and paranoia. The defense argued that Ryan had not fully understood his actions, that his mind had blurred the boundary between reality and imagined threat. But the prosecution reminded the court that after the killing, Ryan had tried to cover up the crime, a decision that required awareness and calculation. Over the course of the trial, witnesses were called neighbors, friends, police officers, and medical experts. Each offered a fragment of the larger story. One neighbor recalled how Lauren had mentioned feeling uncomfortable around Ryan, though she never expected violence. Another described the eerie quiet in the days after her disappearance. The police officers who found her body spoke in subdued, professional tones, their words laced with the weight of what they had seen. Forensic experts detailed the timeline, explaining how the physical evidence contradicted Ryan's scattered version of events. Then came the testimony of Ryan's father. Fragile and visibly shaken, he took the stand, his voice trembling as he recounted the months leading up to the murder. He spoke of his son's anger, the nights filled with shouting, and the fear that had crept into their home. He admitted he tried to talk to Ryan about seeking help but was met with aggression and denial. "I thought he'd calm down," the father said quietly. But he didn't. He got worse. When asked if he believed his son knew what he was doing that night, he paused for a long moment before answering. "I think he did. He just didn't care anymore." Lauren's family listened through tears. Her brother, who had traveled from another province to attend every hearing, often clenched his hands tightly as the details unfolded. During a break, he told a reporter, "This trial isn't about punishment for us. It's about recognition, that Lauren's life mattered, that what happened to her was wrong, and that someone has to answer for it." His words echoed the sentiment of many in the community who had followed the case closely. As the proceedings continued, the jury was shown photographs of the crime scene, carefully cropped and sanitized for court, but still horrifying in their implication. Even those who had heard the story countless times felt the chill of it anew. The prosecution emphasized the brutality of the act, arguing that mental illness did not erase accountability. They described how Ryan had gone upstairs armed with a cane, struck Lauren repeatedly, and then strangled her when she tried to resist. They reminded the jury that he had taken the time to duct tape her body and wrap it in a rug, an act that showed clear intent to hide what he had done. The defense countered by questioning motive. Why would Ryan, who barely knew Lauren, target her so violently? They argued that his paranoia had consumed him, that he believed she was watching or mocking him. They cited his delusions as evidence of a fractured mind incapable of rational thought. But when a psychiatrist testified that Ryan understood right from wrong, that he was paranoid but still aware, the weight of the evidence seemed to shift. The courtroom felt colder that day, as if the truth itself had settled uneasily in the air. Outside the courthouse, the community remained captivated. News segments replayed clips of Lauren's friends lighting candles and holding vigils. Commentators discussed the broader implications: the failures in mental health support, the warning signs ignored, the vulnerability of women living alone. Some blamed the system for not intervening sooner. Others said evil could never be fully explained away by illness or circumstance. In the end, the case had become more than one man's crime. It was a reflection of how society often notices too late the danger growing quietly in plain sight. When closing arguments began, the prosecution spoke with restrained power. "This was not an accident," the lead prosecutor said, pacing slowly before the jury. "This was the deliberate choice of a man who let anger and resentment consume him. Lauren Jarvis did nothing to provoke what happened to her. She was simply living her life, and for that, she was killed." The defense, in contrast, appealed to compassion, urging the jury to consider Ryan's fractured mind. "He is not a cold-blooded killer," his lawyer said softly. "He is a man who fell through the cracks, a man who needed help long before that night." The jury deliberated for 2 days. Outside, rain fell steadily as reporters waited on the courthouse steps. Inside, Lauren's family sat in silence, holding hands, their faces pale with anticipation. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom was hushed. Ryan Farrell was found guilty of second-degree murder. There was no outburst, no visible emotion from him. He simply stared forward as the words were read, his expression blank, as though disconnected from the reality of his own conviction. The judge sentenced him to life in prison with no chance of parole for at least 10 years. For Lauren's family, it was a measure of justice, not complete but something. Her brother later said, "No sentence can bring her back, but knowing he's being held accountable gives us a little peace." As for Ryan's father, he left the courtroom in tears, burdened by the weight of both grief and guilt. In the weeks that followed, the story of Lauren Jarvis began to fade from the headlines, but not from the memories of those who lived nearby. Her former neighbors still spoke of her softly, remembering her kindness and quiet strength. The apartment where she lived was eventually rented to someone new, but for a long time people said it felt different, as if the walls still carried her presence. The tragedy also prompted deeper conversations within the city. Mental health advocates called for better support systems for individuals like Ryan, whose untreated disorders can lead to unpredictable violence. Yet others cautioned that compassion must not come at the expense of accountability. In the end, the case became a stark reminder of two overlapping failures, one personal, one systemic. A man spiraled into madness without help, and an innocent woman paid the ultimate price. Years from now, those who remember will still speak of Lauren Jarvis not as a victim, but as a symbol of what happens when silence surrounds suffering, when warning signs are seen but not acted upon, when isolation festers behind closed doors. Her story remains a haunting echo in the quiet streets of Westmount, where peace was shattered one night and will never fully return.